A police officer beat up a dark-skinned girl on a bicycle and left her on the road. He had no idea who she was. She turned out to be the creator of a clothing brand worn by millions around the world. When her mother told the truth, it became a national scandal. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The evening had folded itself into that heavy silence that sometimes lingers over the city when the sun dips too quickly and the streets begin to thin. Aaliyah Johnson tightened the strap of her backpack and adjusted her position on the bicycle seat as she pedaled through a narrow street lined with dim storefronts. The air carried a faint trace of fried food and exhaust, a mixture that had come to define her nightly ride home from the studio. To most, she was an anonymous young woman on two wheels, wearing plain jeans and a dark hoodie, with the hood pulled up against the creeping chill. Few, if any, could have guessed that the clothes on her back were from the very brand she had built with her own hands, a brand that had become nearly omnipresent across the country. She had designed collections that celebrities and high school kids alike wore, but no one outside her circle of assistants and suppliers knew her face. She liked it that way. The anonymity allowed her to work in peace, to walk through life without the scrutiny fame tends to draw. Her thoughts weren't on the ride itself, but on the designs she had left pinned on the walls of her small studio. She had been sketching new ideas for weeks, a collection inspired by the motion of birds, fabrics that flowed like wings and lines that cut sharp as talons. She thought about which fabric houses might produce the texture she wanted, about the deadlines for the next drop, about whether the overseas production partners could handle the subtle dyes she wanted without ruining the integrity of the design. Her mind was always circling, never still, never completely at rest. She had dreamed of this life when she was a teenager, scribbling ideas in the margins of her notebooks, and now she had it, yet she was still a ghost in her own industry by choice. The brand spoke louder than her name ever could. She stopped briefly at a corner store to grab a bottle of water, nodding politely to the cashier who barely glanced at her, then tucked it into her bag. The streets were quieter now, the traffic heavier on the main avenues, and she decided to cut through a side road that would shave several minutes from her trip. The sky was washed in the last tones of twilight, purple folding into black, and the fluorescent lights from a pharmacy sign hummed in the distance. It was there, on that stretch of road, that the faint sound of tires crunching against asphalt reached her ears. A police cruiser slowed behind her, then pulled abruptly to the side. Two officers stepped out, their boots striking the ground in sharp, confident rhythm. "Evening," one of them called, though his tone carried no warmth. "Stop right there." Aaliyah slowed, her heart giving a small, nervous kick. She had learned long ago not to argue, not to show fear, but she couldn't help the tightness in her throat as she eased her bike toward the curb. One officer, tall and heavy-set with cropped blonde hair, adjusted his belt as if preparing for a confrontation. The other, younger but with the same guarded stance, circled slightly behind her. "Where you headed?" the older one asked. "Home," she replied evenly, keeping her voice calm. "Where's that?" "On the east side, just a few blocks down." He eyed the backpack slung over her shoulder. "What's in the bag?" "My things, clothes, sketchbooks." "You got ID?" "Yes, in the front pocket." She reached slowly, carefully toward her bag, but before she could unzip it, the younger officer stepped forward sharply. "Don't make any sudden moves." "I'm just—" "Hands where I can see them," the older officer barked. Aaliyah froze, raising her hands slightly, palms outward. Her chest tightened. She had seen enough stories on the news, heard enough whispered warnings from friends and her mother to know how quickly these encounters could unravel. She tried to steady her breath, to remind herself she had done nothing wrong. "I need to get my ID," she said. The older officer stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "We'll get it. Step off the bike." She swung her leg over carefully and stood, the bicycle wobbling slightly as it leaned against the curb. The officers circled her like wolves testing the edges of a weak deer. "You live around here?" The younger one pressed. "Yes, like I said, east side." "Funny," the older muttered. "We had a call earlier about a suspect on a bike. Fits your description." "What description?" she asked, her voice cracking under the weight of disbelief. "I'm just coming from work." "Don't get smart," he snapped. The younger one moved forward and grabbed the handlebars of her bike, inspecting the bag as though expecting to find something hidden. "What's this?" he asked, unzipping the front pocket without waiting for her answer. He pulled out a sketchbook, flipping through pages filled with pencil drawings of garments, intricate lines, and bold concepts. "Art class?" he sneered. "I'm a designer," Aaliyah replied, her voice firmer now, though her stomach nodded. The officer let out a short, mocking laugh and tossed the sketchbook onto the ground. The pages splayed open across the pavement, some smudging against the dirt. Aaliyah bent down instinctively to gather them, but before she could, the older officer shoved her shoulder. She stumbled, her knee hitting the ground. "Don't move," he barked. "I'm just picking up my—" His knee came down hard across her thigh, forcing her into the concrete. A sickening crack filled the air, sharp and unmistakable. Pain shot through her leg like lightning, white-hot and consuming. Her scream cut into the night, but no one answered. The street was too empty, too quiet. Her body curled against the assault, her hands trembling as she tried to shield herself. "Please," she gasped, "I didn't do anything." "Stop resisting," he growled. "I'm not resisting." But her voice broke, drowned beneath the sound of boots scuffing against pavement and the crushing weight against her leg. She felt the bones shift, grinding in ways no human body should endure. Her vision blurred at the edges, her ears filled with a rushing sound that drowned even the insults being hurled at her. Finally, the officer stepped back. The older one adjusted his belt again, breathing heavily. The younger glanced at her crumpled body on the ground, then at his partner. "She's down," he said flatly. "Write it up as resisting," the older officer muttered. "We don't need the hassle tonight." "What about an ambulance?" "She'll manage." Their footsteps retreated, echoing against the buildings. Car doors slammed, tires screeched, then silence. Aaliyah lay in the alley, her breath ragged, her body shivering with shock. The world tilted, the pavement rough against her cheek. The smell of oil and garbage thick in her nose. Her leg burned and froze all at once, her hands clawing helplessly against the ground. Minutes stretched into eternity. She thought she might pass out, and part of her wanted to. It was the sound of footsteps that pulled her back. A dog barked faintly, then a woman's voice cried out, "Oh my God, are you okay?" Aaliyah could barely answer. The woman fumbled with her phone, calling for help, kneeling beside her, murmuring words Aaliyah couldn't process. She wanted to beg not to call anyone, not to involve the police again, but her throat was too dry, her voice too broken. She was lifted eventually, the blur of sirens and flashing lights washing over her as strangers carried her into the waiting arms of paramedics. The hospital lights were blinding, sterile, cold. Nurses moved quickly around her, voices clipped and professional. Questions flew, but she had no strength to answer them all. The words compound fracture and surgery floated through the air like foreign objects, detached from the agony pulsing through her body. Hours later, when the worst of the initial storm had passed, Aaliyah lay in a hospital bed, her leg bound in temporary splints, painkillers dulling the sharpest edges of suffering. Her thoughts drifted, scattered, clinging only to the faint image of her mother's face. She wondered if she should call her, if she should let her know. But before she could reach for the phone, the door opened, and there she was. Dr. Carol Johnson still wore her work scrubs, her eyes sharp with worry. She took one look at her daughter, and her breath caught. The sight of Aaliyah's mangled leg stole the strength from her knees, but she forced herself to stand tall. "Mom," Aaliyah whispered, her voice thin, her lips trembling. "He broke it." Carol came to her side instantly, pressing her hand to her daughter's hair, fighting back the tide of rage and sorrow that threatened to consume her. She didn't ask how, not yet. She didn't demand answers. She simply held her daughter's hand, her jaw set in grim resolve. The night stretched long around them, and though Aaliyah drifted into the drugged haze of restless sleep, her mother remained awake, her thoughts sharpening into something far more dangerous than fear. Because the silence of that hospital room was already heavy, with the weight of a fight neither of them had asked for, but one they would no longer be able to avoid. The night after the assault felt endless, a blur of muted voices, the sterile glow of hospital lights, and the faint sound of monitors clicking like impatient metronomes. Aaliyah drifted in and out of drug sleep, her breath shallow, Her brow creased as though even her dreams carried the imprint of pain. Carol Johnson, her mother, never left her side. She sat rigidly in the stiff-backed chair, arms folded tightly as if by sheer will she could keep her daughter's world from unraveling further. Carol had spent decades working in medicine. She had seen trauma in every form: gunshot wounds, mangled car crash survivors, children who fell from windows. She thought she had developed armor, a distance that allowed her to keep moving, to keep saving. But nothing in her years of experience prepared her for the sight of her own daughter, broken on a hospital bed, the vibrant life drained from her face. It wasn't just a wound she was looking at, it was an act of violation. And the emptiness in the hospital corridors told her one thing: there were already efforts to bury what had happened. At first, it was in the smallest details. The admitting nurse avoided eye contact when Carol pressed for specifics about the circumstances logged on her daughter's chart. The form listed accidental trauma during fall from bicycle, a line so bland and detached it might have been copied from a generic template. No mention of officers, no mention of force, just a fall, as though bones snapped themselves on their own. When Carol asked about the attending orthopedic surgeon, the nurse stammered that the case was still pending assignment, despite the fact that hours had already passed. She stood in the hallway, staring at the monitors, at the hurried steps of residents who pretended not to see her. She recognized the pattern. It was the same careful distancing she had witnessed in institutions all her life. Avoid details, pass responsibility, smother the truth beneath layers of paperwork until it suffocates. But this time, she would not allow the silence to win. By morning, when the painkillers had dulled Aaliyah into a fragile rest, Carol stepped outside into the cold air, her phone clutched in hand. She scrolled through her contacts, fingers trembling, unsure of who to call, unsure of where to even begin. She thought about lawyers, about journalists, about former colleagues who might still owe her favors. But the truth was simpler, sharper. The first step had to be light, a signal flare in the dark. And so she opened the camera, lifted it toward her daughter lying pale and small in the hospital bed, and took a single photograph. Her daughter's face was turned toward the window, the heavy plaster cast rising from the bed like a stark monument. On the table beside her lay pages from the sketchbook retrieved from her backpack, drawings half smeared with dirt, but still alive with motion, proof of who she was and what she carried inside her. Carol uploaded the image, and for a moment her hands hesitated on the keyboard. She was a doctor, trained to speak in facts, to measure her words. But now she wrote as a mother. "This is my daughter. Her name is Aaliyah Johnson. Last night she was beaten by police officers and left in the street with her legs shattered. She is 25 years old. She is also the designer and founder of the brand you wear every day. You've worn her clothes, you've posted them, you've seen them on celebrities and strangers alike. You knew her work. You didn't know her name. Now you do. And you know what they did to her." She pressed post and sat frozen, her breath held as though the weight of those words could crush her. For several minutes, nothing happened. The feed stayed still, quiet, the hospital humming around her with its indifference. Then her phone vibrated once, then again, then again. Notifications poured in, multiplying like sparks on dry grass. Within an hour, thousands had shared the post. Strangers left comments, some disbelieving, some outraged, many writing messages of solidarity. A young woman posted a picture of herself in one of Aaliyah's hoodies with the words, "I didn't know her, but I wear her everywhere. We can't stay silent." A musician reposted the image with a caption, "Justice for Aaliyah." Fashion bloggers began piecing together the fragments of rumor they had once heard about the elusive designer behind the brand, realizing the face now matched the myth. By evening, the hashtag Justice for Aaliyah was trending nationwide. People uploaded photos of themselves in her designs, standing in front of mirrors, on street corners, in dorm rooms and offices. The images formed a mosaic of solidarity. Strangers connected not just by fabric, but by outrage. Carol sat at her daughter's bedside watching the waves of messages, her chest aching with both fear and pride. She knew the cost of this exposure. She knew the police would not remain quiet, that attempts to twist the story would arrive swiftly. But she also knew silence was worse. Silence was what they counted on. And for the first time, her daughter's name was not hidden, not buried beneath the brand she had created to shield herself. Now the world saw her and the truth of what had been done to her. Aaliyah woke briefly that night, her eyes glassy under the hospital's dim light. "What's happening?" she asked faintly, her voice hoarse. Carol brushed her hair back gently. "People know, baby. They know your name now." Aaliyah's lips parted in confusion. "They weren't supposed to." "They had to," Carol said softly. "You gave them beauty. Now they'll give you strength." Her daughter's eyes closed again, exhaustion pulling her under. But Carol sat upright, wide awake, staring at the steady rise and fall of her chest. The post had been the first move. What came next would be harder, sharper, and filled with risks. But there was no turning back. Outside, the city was already buzzing with a story that would not stay hidden. And inside the hospital room, a mother sat ready to fight a battle she had never imagined, but one she knew she could not lose. The days that followed felt like watching a spark catch fire in a dry field. At first, it was only a few scattered voices on social media, a handful of reposts from fashion enthusiasts, and small accounts claiming disbelief that the woman they saw lying broken in a hospital bed was the same one behind the brand they loved. But within hours, the trickle became a stream, and within a day, it was a flood. Aaliyah Johnson's name was everywhere. For years, she had worked deliberately in obscurity, letting her clothing speak for her, creating a world of style without ever stepping into the glare of publicity. Now, against her will, her name and her story were being broadcast to strangers around the globe. News outlets began to pick up the post Carol had written. Local blogs published quick stories about the mysterious designer whose face was suddenly revealed under violent circumstances. From there, the coverage snowballed. A gossip site connected the dots between anonymous interviews given years before by suppliers who described a young black woman with a sharp eye and relentless drive, and the revelation that Aaliyah was that very woman. By the second evening, mainstream newspapers ran headlines asking, "Who is Aaliyah Johnson?" and the hidden designer whose voice was broken but not silenced. Inside the hospital, Aaliyah wrestled with this unwanted exposure. She had always seen herself as the ghost of her own empire, crafting collections in silence while others modeled them, while anonymous logos adorned the world. Now her face was everywhere on screens, in hashtags, in photos that strangers shared with heartfelt captions. She lay in bed, her body heavy with medication, her mind whirling with confusion. She wanted to be invisible, yet invisibility had brought her nothing but vulnerability. Invisibility had given the officers the confidence to harm her without a thought. Now people knew her, and the knowledge burned like both a wound and a shield. Her studio staff began sending messages of support. Assistants wrote that customers had flooded their inboxes with orders, not to buy clothes but to send notes of solidarity. Suppliers who once spoke to her in curt, detached tones now wrote personal emails expressing outrage. A seamstress from Los Angeles posted a video holding up one of Aaliyah's jackets and saying, "I've been proud to sew her designs for years. Now I'm proud to say her name." The effect was immediate and undeniable. People who had never cared about where their clothing came from were suddenly united in defense of the quiet woman behind them. But the backlash was just as swift. The police department released a terse statement claiming that officers had responded to suspicious behavior and that the suspect had resisted lawful instructions. They refused to name the officers involved, citing ongoing internal review. Almost instantly, accounts on the fringes of the internet began pushing alternative narratives. Posts appeared alleging that Aaliyah had a history of confrontations, though no such history existed. Grainy photos of her at college parties were dredged up, stripped of context and framed as evidence of an unruly personality. Anonymous threads claimed she was chasing fame, that her mother had staged the photo for attention. Carol watched these attacks unfold with a mixture of fury and grim recognition. She had known the smear would come. It was how systems protected themselves. Yet she also saw something unexpected. For every attack, there were dozens, sometimes hundreds of voices rising in defense. Strangers called out the lies, posted screenshots of the brand's history, pointed out the clear attempt at character assassination. Carol realized then that the story had grown beyond her control, beyond even Aaliyah's. It belonged to the people now, to a collective voice unwilling to let this narrative be twisted into silence. Across the country, demonstrations began forming organically. They weren't marches in the traditional sense. They were subtle, symbolic, but powerful. In Atlanta, a group of college students gathered in the park wearing nothing but pieces from Aaliyah's brand. They stood in silence for an hour, holding signs that read, "We see you," and "Justice for Aaliyah." In New York, dozens of young people walked through Times Square, wearing her hoodies, their presence a wordless protest against erasure. Social media filled with these images, each one reinforcing the idea that her designs were more than fabric, they were a banner of resistance. Meanwhile, in the hospital, Aaliyah struggled with conflicting emotions. Her body was still wrecked with pain, her leg bound in a rigid cast that seemed to mock her independence. She felt vulnerable, exposed, trapped. And yet when she opened her phone and saw thousands of strangers wearing her creations as symbols of defiance, something stirred inside her. She had never sought fame, but perhaps fame had sought her for a reason. One evening she looked at her mother with weary eyes. "I didn't want this," she whispered. "I know," Carol answered, her voice calm but firm. "But it's here, and sometimes the thing you don't want is the thing you're meant to carry." "But they'll twist it," Aaliyah said. "They'll make me into something I'm not." "They already are." Carol reached for her daughter's hand, squeezing it gently. "Then we show them who you really are, not who they say. You gave people beauty, Aaliyah. Now you give them truth." The words echoed inside Aaliyah long after her mother left to fetch water from the vending machine. She stared at the ceiling, at the fluorescent lights flickering faintly, and for the first time since the assault, she began to consider that maybe her life could not return to what it was. Maybe she was no longer simply the quiet designer in the background. Maybe she was something else now, an unwilling but necessary voice. Outside her hospital window, the city pulsed with tension. Demonstrations spread, hashtags multiplied, and whispers grew into demands. The police tried to tighten their grip, to dismiss the protests as fleeting noise, but the images kept coming. Streets filled with silent figures clad in her brand, graffiti murals of her silhouette on a bike, petitions gathering signatures by the tens of thousands. What had started as a mother's desperate cry online had become a national uproar. Aaliyah, still trapped in her hospital bed, could only watch from afar, her heart torn between fear and determination. Yet in the quiet of her room, as the monitors beeped steadily and the world outside roared her name, she understood a truth that had been hidden from her for too long. She had spent years being invisible, and invisibility had nearly cost her everything. Now, against her will, but with the strength of thousands behind her, she was seen. And once seen, she could not be unseen again. The fire had started, and no matter how the authorities tried to smother it, the flames only leapt higher. The next phase, Aaliyah realized, would test her in ways she had never imagined. She closed her eyes, gripping her mother's words tightly in her mind. If they were going to twist her image, then she would reshape it herself. If they wanted to silence her, she would learn how to make her voice carry farther than fabric ever had. And as the night deepened, with the glow of her phone still lighting up with messages from strangers calling her name, Aaliyah understood. The fight was no longer just about her. It was about every unseen face, every unheard voice. It was about the silence that had been forced on too many for too long. She was no longer invisible. She was a symbol. And though the weight of that truth terrified her, it also gave her a new kind of strength, the strength of knowing she was not alone. The storm had broken wide open, and by the time Aaliyah was discharged from the hospital, the world outside her small life had transformed. What had started as a mother's desperate plea online had become a cultural earthquake that refused to subside. The protests had not dwindled. Instead, they had multiplied, spreading from city to city, carried forward by the quiet strength of people who saw in her not just a victim, but a mirror of themselves. The news could no longer ignore it, even as officials scrambled to frame the narrative in their favor. Television anchors who had once been cautious about naming her now said her full name with solemnity, framing her as a symbol of resilience. It unnerved her to watch, because she knew that what people were seeing was not the whole of her, but a reflection refracted through outrage. And yet she also understood that something larger than herself was unfolding, something she could not shrink away from. The first time she agreed to speak publicly, it was not before a courtroom or in a studio with cameras and makeup crews, but from her hospital bed through a simple video call. She wore no elaborate outfit, just a plain sweatshirt from her own collection, the brand's logo small against her chest. Her face was pale from weeks of pain and medication, but her eyes were steady as she looked into the lens. "They tried to break me," she said, her voice calm and deliberate. "And they did break my leg, but they did not break my will. I create clothing to give people strength, to let them feel seen, and today I feel the strength of every one of you who stood up when I couldn't. This is bigger than me. It's about all of us. We deserve to walk freely, to breathe freely, to live without fear. And I'm not invisible anymore." The video rippled outward like a wave. News outlets replayed it endlessly, dissecting each sentence. Social media platforms carried it across languages and borders, spreading her words far beyond the streets of Atlanta. Supporters gathered in city squares projecting her message onto walls of buildings. Students played it in classrooms. For many, it was the first time they had heard her speak at all, and the quiet certainty in her voice cut deeper than any speech crafted by politicians. As her words traveled, pressure on the police department mounted. Journalists uncovered older cases that mirrored hers, complaints of force dismissed, reports written off, families intimidated into silence. Patterns that had once been hidden behind bureaucratic language were now exposed to the light, each revelation sparking fresh outrage. Officials tried to temper the flames with promises of reviews and reforms, but the stories kept piling up. It was no longer a question of one officer or one night. It was a question of a system that had for too long allowed violence to masquerade as order. Aaliyah followed these developments from her bed, a mixture of vindication and sorrow coursing through her. Each story validated what had been done to her, but each story also reminded her that she was not alone in her suffering. There were others, boys and girls, women and men, who had been left broken in alleys and on sidewalks with no one to speak their names. She realized that the weight she carried now was not just her own pain, but the memory of theirs. Her own recovery was slow and brutal. Physical therapy became the rhythm of her days, the exercises relentless, the pain a constant companion. Some mornings her body resisted so strongly that she thought she would collapse before even beginning. Her therapist, a gentle but unyielding man named Daniel, guided her with patience. He reminded her of progress when she could see none, of strength when she felt only weakness. "You're pushing harder than most grown men I've worked with," he told her once, and she gave a thin smile, replying, "They don't have my reason." For Aaliyah, every painful step was not only for herself, but for the countless others who might never walk freely again. Letters and drawings from strangers poured in. Children sent sketches of her in capes and crowns. Teenagers wrote that her story had given them courage to speak up in classrooms or against bullies. Parents thanked her for reminding them to protect their children's voices. Each message, no matter how small, became fuel for her spirit. She pinned some of them on the wall of her studio once she was strong enough to return, surrounding herself with reminders that her pain had been transformed into something larger, something communal. Months later, when she was finally able to stand with the aid of crutches, her team prepared the first fashion show since the attack. It was not intended as a spectacle, but as a statement. The venue was modest compared to the industry's grand halls, but it was filled with anticipation, the air buzzing with the weight of expectation. Designers, journalists, and ordinary people alike gathered, all of them waiting to see not just clothing, but the return of the woman whose name they now knew. The show began in silence. The first models walked the runway wearing garments unlike anything Aaliyah had shown before. Heavy fabrics that at first looked like chains draped across shoulders dissolved into delicate patterns resembling wings. Jackets that began with harsh, sharp lines unfurled into flowing silhouettes. The message was unmistakable. Transformation, resilience, chains turned into freedom. Each piece carried the echoes of her struggle, the pain transmuted into design. The audience sat spellbound, not clapping at first, but watching with reverence, as though witnessing something sacred. And then, when the final model stepped aside, Aaliyah appeared. She walked slowly, leaning on her crutches, her face serene but determined. The crowd rose as one, applause cascading through the hall, some people shouting her name, others simply standing in silence with tears on their faces. She reached the center of the runway, paused and looked out at the sea of people. For the first time, she did not hide. For the first time, she embraced being seen. She smiled, not a smile of triumph, but of acceptance. And then she bowed her head slightly before turning back. Later that night, she sat with her mother in the quiet of her apartment, exhausted but at peace. Carol poured her a cup of tea and said softly, "You know this isn't the end, don't you?" "I know," Aaliyah replied, her voice low, "but it's the beginning of something else." Outside, the world had changed. The department faced federal oversight, officers were suspended, reforms were demanded at City Hall. More importantly, people had found their voices. The protests had given rise to movements, local councils voted on new oversight boards, and young people continued to wear her brand as both fashion and declaration. The scar on her body would remain, a constant reminder of violence endured, but it was no longer just a mark of pain. It was proof of survival. Aaliyah leaned back, closing her eyes, her mother's words still hanging in the air. She thought of the letters tucked in her drawer, of the sketches pinned on her walls, of the crowds chanting her name not as a brand, but as a person. She had been invisible once, not anymore. And as much as the weight of visibility frightened her, she knew she could carry it, not only for herself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced. For a long moment she sat listening to the city outside her window, the sound of voices drifting in the night, a reminder that she was no longer alone. And in that quiet, she understood the truth that had carried her through all of it. They had broken her body, but they had given her voice to the world, and that voice was not going away. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Take a moment to watch our other videos for more powerful stories still to come. And please share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too important to keep to yourself.